All right, so now we're going to go into a little bit of the global loanable funds market. So one of the things with capital is we can invest it anywhere in the world. There are US investors that have invested in Europe. Think about Disneyland opening Disney Paris or Disney Tokyo. So companies invest all over the world. And also, other countries or people from all over the world invest in the US. A big holder of US investments, US debt, come from the Middle East, oil producing countries, China, Germany. Germany's running a big trade surplus with the US, so they put a lot of money into our economy, Norway. So capital will flow all over the world. So here's a really simple example to explain why. I did black again. So we have loanable funds and we have interest rates. And this is going to be for the US. Then we're going to do over here loanable funds and interest rates in the UK. There are all sorts of domestic factors that determine interest rates in your country, right? So fiscal policy, monetary policy, income, inflation, all of these things go into effect to determine interest rates in your country. So suppose, just for starting, we have demand in the US and we have supply in the US, and that's going to give us an interest rate of 6%. But in the UK, maybe their economy is a little bit more suppressed. Their interest rates are 2%. So think about this from a global perspective. If you're in the UK and you can choose to save money wherever you want, demand, supply, would you want to choose to save money in the UK and earn 6%, or would you want to choose to save money in the US and earn 6%? 2% in the UK, 6% in the US. Pretty obvious. You're going to want to go to the US. So what happens in the US is the capital, our savings, or savings in general, not necessarily US savings, we started up here at 6%. And then over here, loanable funds again, interest rates. This is the US. This is the UK. And the savings in the UK was much lower, 2%. So what's going to happen is money is going to go from the UK capital into the US. And we can show that in a few different ways. I typically get this nice 4%. What happens to me is I show it as supply plus net capital inflows, because that is a capital flow from the UK to the US, would increase our available amount of savings, right? Now our savings is domestic and foreign, but meanwhile, over here, savings plus net capital inflow, which for the UK is going to be negative, would decrease. All right, so the last part we want to talk about is inflation and interest rates. What I had said earlier is that when I am making a decision to save, one of the variables I'm going to look at is going to be future inflation. So if inflation is high, I'm going to probably reduce my savings until that interest rate rises to reflect the higher inflation rate. Same thing works on the borrowing side. If I think inflation is going to go up in the future, I want to borrow today, right? Take advantage of low interest rates, make my investments that are going to increase in price with inflation. So anything, right, that typically drives interest rates is this last thing: people's expectation about inflation. So here's what I mean, and we have a special name for this that we're going to call the Fisher effect. So with the Fisher effect, the idea here is that both inflation and interest rates are going to move proportionally. So as we were talking about, if borrowers expect an increase in future inflation, today that's going to drive our behavior. So on the demand side, on the borrowing side, a higher future inflation lowers your real interest rate. So the real interest rate being nominal minus inflation, if this goes up, then we're going to expect the real interest rate to go down. So that means we're going to increase our borrowing. But on the supply side, if we get paid less in real terms, we are going to decrease our willingness to save. So together, right, these two decisions will
essentially cause the nominal rate to move in proportion while the real interest rate remains constant, something I'll show here in a couple of slides. So this is that equation I just put out. Real interest rate is the nominal minus expected inflation, right? So in the real world, we know neither borrower or lender know what future inflation is going to be. So we do this based off of expected inflation. So we make an agreement on the nominal interest rate, which means when inflation differs from what we expect, that's going to create winners and losers. So according to the Fisher effect, and this is what we've observed over time, an increase in expected future inflation drives up the nominal interest rate just enough, leaving the real interest rate unchanged. So how this happens is through a decrease in supply, our willingness to save goes down, but people's willingness to borrow money goes up because it's a lower real interest rate. So on the next slide, I'll show you that graph. But as I end here, that nominal interest rate moves proportional to the increase in inflation.
Draw a graph of the Fisher effect. Loanable funds, interest rate. So suppose we have some, why does it keep switching over? I want to erase that line. This is our demand for loanable funds when we think inflation is going to be nice and low. And this is our supply of loanable funds when we think inflation is going to be nice and low. So maybe the equilibrium interest rate is going to be 4%. Now suppose we hit a high inflationary environment. Maybe there is a massive oil shock, oil prices skyrocket, major supply disruptions cause inflation to shoot up. And we expect inflation now to go from 2%, not 2%, but it's going to increase to 10%. Are you willing to supply money for a 4% return? The answer is no, right? Before you were getting a real interest rate of 2, 4 minus 2. 4 was your nominal, 2 was inflation. So you were getting a 2% real return. If you think inflation is going to go up to 10%, you're going to now need a 12% nominal interest rate, 2 minus 10, to get that same interest rate. So you're going to reduce your supply of loanable funds. You don't want to save until that interest rate goes up. But meanwhile, firms are going to increase their demand at the same time. Right? They do want to borrow today. And these two factors will put the pressure on interest rates to rise to 12%. So essentially, our future expectations of inflation will drive interest rates today. And this is really a big driver of financial markets. If borrowers think inflation is going to remain low, they're willing to borrow at lower rates. But as soon as we think inflation is going to rise, they're going to increase their expectation and they're going to want to borrow at a higher interest rate. Do a little practice question. If the United States imports more goods from Japan than it exports to Japan, how will the difference be financed? So if the U.S. imports more goods from Japan than exports to Japan, how will the difference be financed? So remember the net capital inflow thing, right? And with Japan, net capital inflows were imports minus exports. So it was the inverse of our trade deficit. Right? So we are running a trade deficit. We are buying more from Japan than they're buying from us. U.S. consumers will borrow money from domestic banks. Not the case. Right? We are really borrowing money from Japan. The U.S. will buy more Japanese assets. We're not buying Japanese assets. We're buying goods. The U.S. will sell assets. And this is that channel, right? When we look at Japan and the U.S., right? The U.S. gets goods from Japan. Meanwhile, Japan sends us money. They buy our assets. So that one sounds really good. So I'm going to kind of tentatively circle C. The United States will sell assets to Japan, which would reduce its liabilities. Them buying our assets has no impact on their liabilities. It increases our liabilities. It's money we owe Japan. So C is going to be your correct answer. Would the partner answer the following question? Suppose that expected inflation rises from 3 to 6%. And so to walk you through this, think about the real interest rate being nominal minus inflation. If this goes up, all else equal, real interest rates would go down. So who gains, who loses? Savers will lose, borrowers will gain. Savers, lose, borrowers gain. How will the nominal rate likely be affected? Well, in the short run, it wouldn't, but it will go up with inflation as investors, savers, and borrowers change their expectation. What will happen to the equilibrium quantity of loanable funds? Well, initially, it would decline because people aren't going to be saving. But once people adjust, it should remain relatively unchanged or ambiguous.